He was a billionaire CEO, ruthless in business, and cold in love. She was just an intern determined to prove herself in a world that never played fair. But when fate threw them together, sparks ignited, hearts collided, and a love neither of them expected turned their worlds upside down. The skyline of New York City stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Blackwood Enterprises, a billion-dollar empire built by a man feared and respected in equal measure, Ethan Blackwood. Ethan sat in his massive corner office, eyes scanning through the financial reports on his sleek, modern desk. The numbers were perfect, just as he expected. He had spent his entire life building an empire that was efficient, disciplined, and absolutely free of distractions, especially the kind that came in the form of emotions. To Ethan, love was a liability, a weakness that turned great men into fools. He had seen it firsthand. His own mother had abandoned him for money, proving that love was nothing more than a bargaining tool in a world driven by power. His employees knew one thing: Ethan Blackwood did not tolerate nonsense. That's why, when a sudden loud gasp echoed through the office, followed by a crash, Ethan's jaw clenched. "Oh my God, no, 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 this is bad. This is very, very bad." A flurry of panicked words filled the air, and Ethan barely had time to register what was happening before a wave of scalding hot coffee spilled down his tailored Armani suit. The sharp sting of the heat hit his skin, but the real pain was in his pride. A small, wide-eyed figure stood before him, looking horrified. I am so sorry. I wasn't looking, and the door just. Ethan slowly lifted his gaze, his ice-blue eyes locking onto the culprit, a young woman, likely in her early 20s, with chestnut-brown hair tied into a messy bun. She had large, expressive eyes that were now filled with pure panic, her cheeks flushed red in embarrassment. She was not what he expected. Ethan had dealt with many women before, elegant, poised, high-society women, who dripped in diamonds and knew how to speak in carefully crafted tones. But this girl, she was a disaster wrapped in innocence. Her oversized bag was slipping off her shoulder, her ID badge hung awkwardly from her neck, and she was holding a now empty coffee cup in one trembling hand. Ethan exhaled sharply, his patience already wearing thin. "Who the hell are you?" The girl blinked. "I'm Sophie Carter, the new intern." Of course she was. He should have known, because only an intern would have the audacity to spill coffee all over the CEO on their first day. The office had gone deathly silent. Employees who had been working diligently a moment ago were now frozen, their eyes darting between Ethan and Sophie like they were watching a bomb about to explode. Ethan stood up slowly, his 6'2" frame towering over Sophie. She instinctively took a small step back, but didn't break eye contact. That intrigued him. Most people, executives, board members, competitors feared him. Even hardened businessmen avoided looking him in the eye for too long. But this intern, she was terrified, but still standing her ground. Interesting. Still, he wasn't about to let her off easy. "Tell me, Miss Carter." His voice was dangerously calm. "Do you think spilling coffee on your boss is an ideal way to start your internship?" Sophie swallowed hard, her eyes flicking toward the massive stain on his ridiculously expensive suit. "I wouldn't say ideal, but, unique." A hushed gasp rippled through the office. Did she just make a joke? Ethan narrowed his eyes, half expecting her to crumble under the weight of his glare. But instead she winced, biting her lip, as if realizing her mistake. I'm really, really sorry. I'll pay for your dry cleaning." "Oh wait, can you even dry clean a suit like that? Maybe I should just buy you a new one. Not that I can afford that, but maybe I can find a..." Was she rambling? Ethan wasn't sure what was more annoying, the fact that his suit was ruined, or the fact that Sophie Carter was kind of adorable when she was nervous. Damn it. He needed to shut this down. Enough. His voice came out sharper than he intended, and Sophie instantly clamped her mouth shut. "I don't need your money." He reached for a napkin, dabbing the coffee stain on his shirt. "What I do need is competent employees who can walk through a door without causing a disaster." Sophie looked thoroughly embarrassed, her fingers twisting the strap of her bag, but then something shifted in her expression. Instead of tearing up or running away, she straightened her back, lifting her chin ever so slightly. I may have had a bad start, but I promise you I'm not incompetent. Ethan arched a brow. We'll see about that. His voice was clipped, but deep down, he felt something he hadn't in a very long time: curiosity. As Ethan walked toward his office to change, he caught a glimpse of Sophie again. This time she was picking up the coffee cup she had dropped, her movements careful and precise. She was still flustered, but there was determination in her eyes. She was different, and that was a problem. Ethan Blackwood didn't do different. He ran his life with logic and control, and this intern, she was neither of those things. He would have to ignore whatever strange stirring he felt in his chest when he looked at her. Because if there was one thing he knew for certain, falling for someone like Sophie Carter would be the worst mistake of his life. Ethan Blackwood did not like surprises. He thrived on control, precision and efficiency, a carefully crafted system that ensured everything in his company ran flawlessly. That's why, when his chief assistant, Daniel, knocked on his office door with a nervous expression, Ethan already knew he wasn't going to like what came next. "Sir, we have a problem." Ethan looked up from his laptop, his fingers pausing mid-typing. His voice was sharp. "Then fix it." Daniel hesitated. "I can't." That got Ethan's full attention. He sat back, arms crossing over his broad chest. "Explain." Daniel cleared his throat. "Your assistant Claire had a family emergency. She had to leave for 2 weeks." Ethan exhaled sharply. "So get someone else." Daniel winced. "That's the thing, sir. The only available person is Sophie Carter." Silence. Cold. Dead. Silence. Ethan stared at Daniel, unblinking. He was convinced he must have misheard. "Excuse me," Daniel swallowed. "She's the only intern with experience in project research, and since you're leading the Harrington deal personally, we need someone who understands the logistics." Sophie worked on the presentation materials. Ethan's jaw ticked. Sophie Carter. The walking disaster. The coffee spiller. The woman who somehow lingered in his mind, even though he had absolutely no reason to think about her. This was his worst nightmare. Sophie was just finishing up her notes at her small desk when her supervisor, Linda, approached her with an unreadable expression. "Sophie, the CEO needs an assistant for the next 2 weeks. You've been assigned." Sophie blinked. "I'm sorry." "What?" Linda sighed. "Congratulations. You're officially Ethan Blackwood's personal assistant." If Sophie had been holding a cup of coffee, she was pretty sure she would have dropped it again. "You mean the same Ethan Blackwood who I spilled coffee on?" Linda pinched the bridge of her nose. "Yes." Sophie swallowed hard. "The same Ethan Blackwood who glares like he wants to set me on fire with his mind." Linda nodded. "Yes." "Oh, this was bad. This was very, very bad." Sophie had spent exactly 2 days in this company, and already she had made a fool of herself in front of the CEO. And now she was going to spend 2 whole weeks working directly under him. This was a recipe for disaster. Sophie mentally prepared herself as she knocked on Ethan's office door. A deep, commanding voice answered. "Come in." She stepped inside, her heart hammering. Ethan Blackwood sat behind his massive desk, looking impossibly powerful in a crisp navy suit. His sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and controlled demeanor made him look like he belonged on the cover of a Fortune 500 magazine. Except right now, he looked beyond irritated. He barely glanced at her. "You're late." Sophie frowned, checking her watch. "It's 8:59. Ethan's gaze lifted slowly, locking onto hers. "And what time were you supposed to be here?" Sophie bit her lip. 8:55. Ethan leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. Sophie closed her eyes for a brief second. Oh dear God, this was going to be hell. The morning was pure torture. Sophie had to follow Ethan everywhere, from board meetings to conference calls to office inspections. And the man was relentless. He worked like a machine, his voice firm, his words precise. He didn't tolerate interruptions, mistakes, or distractions. And unfortunately for Sophie, she was all three. She struggled to keep up with his pace, scribbling notes so fast she nearly gave herself a cramp. At one point, she tried handing him a report, only for him to take it without acknowledging her existence. She scowled. "You're welcome, Mr. Blackwood." Ethan paused for half a second before speaking. "You talk too much," Sophie huffed, "and you talk too little." A muscle in Ethan's jaw twitched, but he didn't respond. Still, Sophie could swear that, for just a brief moment, she saw something in his expression. Amusement? No, that couldn't be right. By the time evening rolled around, Sophie was exhausted. She had somehow survived her first day of assistant duty, and she was so ready to go home and collapse on her bed. But fate had other plans. Just as Sophie was packing up her things, thunder rumbled outside. A storm had rolled in, rain pouring against the glass windows in heavy sheets. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I need those files from legal before tomorrow morning." Sophie hesitated. "I can go get them." Ethan shot her a look. "You think I'm going to let you run across the city in a storm?" Sophie blinked. "Well, no, but sit down." His voice was low, commanding. "You're not leaving until the rain slows down." She hesitated before sinking onto the couch. "I don't mind the rain." Ethan's eyes darkened slightly. "I do." There was something about the way he said it, something deeper, like he wasn't just talking about the weather. For the first time since she met him, Sophie felt something shift. A strange tension filled the air, unspoken, undeniable. For a moment the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm between them. The rain outside had turned into a relentless downpour, drumming against the glass walls of Ethan Blackwood's high-rise office. Sophie sat stiffly on the couch, hugging her arms around herself as she stared out at the stormy city skyline. Ethan, on the other hand, was completely still, his sharp blue eyes locked on his laptop screen as he typed away. The only sound in the room was the soft clatter of keys and the distant rumble of thunder. Sophie shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't sure why she felt so uneasy. Maybe it was because she was alone with Ethan in his dimly lit office. Maybe it was because the storm outside felt oddly intimate, like it had sealed them off from the rest of the world. Or maybe it was because she could feel Ethan's presence too much. Even though he was seated at his desk, several feet away, it was like he was too close, too intense, too overwhelming. She stole a glance at him. His suit jacket was draped over the chair. His sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, and the glow of the laptop screen highlighted the sharp angles of his face. Damn it, why does he have to be so ridiculously attractive? She quickly turned away, biting her lip. Ethan must have sensed her restless energy because he suddenly spoke. "You're fidgeting." Sophie jumped slightly. "What?" He didn't look up from his laptop. "You've been shifting in your seat for the past 10 minutes. If you have something to say, say it." Sophie scowled. "I wasn't fidgeting." Ethan finally lifted his gaze. His piercing blue eyes pinned her to the spot. "Lying is a bad habit, Miss Carter." Sophie crossed her arms, trying to fight the warmth crawling up her neck. "So is being an emotionless robot, but I don't comment on your life choices." A slow, almost dangerous smirk touched Ethan's lips. "That's because I don't make mistakes." Sophie gaped at him. "Oh wow, so humble." Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You seem to have a problem with me." Sophie let out a humorless laugh. "Gee, I wonder why." His lips twitched like he was trying not to be amused. "Tell me." She hesitated. Was he actually curious? She sighed, rubbing her forehead. "You don't even realize, do you?" Ethan arched a brow. "Realize what?" "That you're impossible to work with." Sophie burst out, throwing her hands in the air. "You bark orders, never say please or thank you, and you make people feel like they're completely invisible. It's frustrating." Ethan studied her, his gaze flickering with something unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then finally, he murmured, "And yet you're still here." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. There was something different about the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about her presence in the office, like he was talking about something else, something neither of them wanted to admit. The rain didn't let up for another hour. Ethan had returned to work, but his focus was off, and it was all because of her. Sophie Carter, the walking disaster, the woman who never backed down from him, no matter how much he tried to intimidate her. She was supposed to be just another intern, someone he barely acknowledged, someone who didn't matter, and yet, he couldn't stop noticing her. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way she chewed on her lip when she was lost in thought, the way she breathed. For God's sake, it was distracting, irritating, unacceptable. Ethan clenched his jaw. This is just proximity. That's all it was. He was only noticing her because she was suddenly in his space, forcing herself into his daily routine. As soon as Claire returned, everything would go back to normal, wouldn't it? When Sophie shivered for the third time, Ethan sighed. "You're cold." She jumped slightly. "What? No, I'm fine." Ethan gave her a pointed look. "You're shaking." Sophie tightened her arms around herself stubbornly. "It's just a little cold. I'll survive." Ethan exhaled sharply. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he shrugged off his expensive designer suit jacket and tossed it at her. Sophie barely caught it in time. "Hey, what? Wear it." She blinked, staring at the jacket in her hands. It was warm, carrying the faint scent of his cologne, something dark and expensive, with a hint of spice. She swallowed. I don't need it." Ethan arched a brow. "Then give it back." Sophie hesitated. Her fingers curled around the fabric involuntarily. He smirked, as if he had won. "That's what I thought." Sophie huffed, but slipped the jacket over her shoulders anyway, trying to ignore the way it felt like his presence was wrapped around her. She glared at him. "You are the most infuriating man on the planet." Ethan simply went back to work. "So I've been told." By the time the storm finally let up, it was already late. Ethan glanced at the time before turning to Sophie. "I'll have my driver take you home." Sophie shook her head. "I can take the subway." Ethan's expression turned icy. "At this hour, alone, no." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, so now you care." He didn't answer. He just walked past her, pulling out his phone to text his driver. "Let's go." Sophie sighed in defeat and followed him downstairs. They rode in silence, but something had shifted between them. The air was heavier, charged. Sophie stole a glance at Ethan, watching the way the city lights cast shadows over his sharp jawline. She hated to admit it, but for the first time, she was seeing him differently. Not just as her impossible, cold-hearted CEO, but as a man, a dangerous man, one she shouldn't get too close to. And yet, her heart was already betraying her. Ethan Blackwood had never considered himself a possessive man. He was logical, rational, detached, and yet, the sight before him made his blood boil. Across the sleek, modern office space, Sophie was laughing, with Ryan Carter. Ethan's jaw clenched as he watched them from his office. Ryan, his company's newest senior consultant, stood too close, flashing his usual charming grin at Sophie. And Sophie, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside Ethan, was smiling back. That smile. Ethan's stomach twisted in a way he didn't understand. Sophie had smiled plenty of times before, but this was different. This was a smile she never gave him. His grip on the pen in his hand tightened, threatening to snap it in half. "Something wrong, sir?" Ethan barely acknowledged his assistant, Lucas, who stood beside his desk. Without tearing his gaze away from Sophie, he muttered, "Who is he?" Lucas followed Ethan's line of sight and instantly smirked. "That's Ryan Carter, one of our best consultants, Harvard graduate, brilliant strategist." And he hesitated before adding, "Apparently very good with the ladies." Ethan's scowl deepened. Lucas continued, clearly enjoying this. "I hear he's single too. And judging by that conversation, it looks like he's very interested in Sophie." Ethan's fingers curled into a fist. A sharp, burning sensation ran through his chest, an emotion he refused to name. Possessiveness, jealousy, it was ridiculous. Sophie wasn't his. She was an intern, his employee. He had no reason, no right, to feel anything. And yet, when Ryan leaned in slightly, whispering something in Sophie's ear that made her giggle, Ethan couldn't stand it. With deadly precision, he set his pen down, rose from his chair, and strode out of his office. Sophie was mid-laugh when she felt it. A presence, a shift in the air so sudden that the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She turned slightly, just enough to see Ethan Blackwood walking toward them. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his icy blue eyes that made her heart stumble in her chest. Carter. It wasn't a greeting, it was a summon. Sophie blinked. Yes? Ethan's gaze flicked to Ryan, his posture stiff and controlled. I need you in my office, now. Sophie frowned. But I was just, now, Miss Carter. Ryan arched a brow, clearly amused. Looks like the boss needs you. He smirked at Ethan. Don't work her too hard, Blackwood. Ethan's jaw ticked, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned sharply and walked away, fully expecting Sophie to follow. Sophie sighed, shooting Ryan an apologetic look, before hurrying after Ethan. As she stepped into his office, she barely had time to process anything, before the glass door shut behind her, with a soft click. The silence was thick. Ethan stood by the window, his hands tucked into his pockets, his shoulders tense. Sophie crossed her arms. Okay, what was that? Ethan didn't turn. What was what? Sophie huffed. That whole caveman act. You basically dragged me away from a conversation. Ethan's fingers twitched. He inhaled deeply, forcing his voice to remain even. You're an intern, Miss Carter, not here to flirt with employees. Sophie's mouth fell open. Excuse me. Ethan finally turned. His expression was blank, but his eyes were burning. Ryan Carter is not a suitable distraction for you. Sophie let out a breathless laugh. Distraction? Are you serious? Ethan remained silent. Sophie took a step closer, her frustration rising. Do you even hear yourself? What does it matter to you who I talk to? Ethan's jaw clenched. It was a good question. A question he didn't have a rational answer for, because the truth was unacceptable. The truth was, he hated the idea of Sophie looking at anyone else the way she looked at him. Hated the idea of another man making her laugh. Hated the idea of her smiling for someone who wasn't him. Ethan took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. Sophie's breath hitched, as she suddenly felt too warm. His voice was low. I don't like distractions in my office. Sophie swallowed. Then maybe you should stop being one. Ethan stilled. His eyes darkened, flickering down to her lips, for just a fraction of a second. Sophie caught it. Her heart pounded. Something dangerous passed between them. A tension so thick, it was almost suffocating. And then a sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. Ethan stepped back instantly, his expression slamming shut, like a steel wall. Come in. Lucas entered, glancing between the two of them, before raising an eyebrow. Our bad timing. Sophie exhaled shakily. Perfect timing. And with that she turned and walked out, leaving Ethan to stare after her, his fists clenched, his mind a mess, and his jealousy burning like a wildfire. Ethan Blackwood didn't lose focus. Ever. He was a man of discipline, precision and control. But tonight, all of that was slipping. His mind was a battlefield, one side demanding logic, the other drowning in irrational emotions he didn't want to name. The trigger, Sophie Carter. After their heated encounter in his office, he told himself to forget it, to push her away like he did everyone else. But he couldn't. He could still hear her frustrated voice challenging him, still see the fire in her gorgeous green eyes. And worst of all, he could still feel the way the air had thickened between them, the invisible pull, dragging him closer, threatening to undo him completely. And now, she was here. Not in his thoughts, not in his imagination, but right in front of him. Sophie stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, her figure illuminated by the golden chandeliers. Tonight was the company's annual charity gala, an event Ethan attended every year with zero interest in socializing. But tonight was different, because tonight, Sophie Carter had arrived, and she was breathtaking. She wore a deep red gown, the silk hugging her curves in a way that made Ethan's throat go dry. Her dark brown hair was styled into soft waves that cascaded over her shoulders, and when she looked up, meeting his gaze across the room, something inside him snapped. For the first time in his life, Ethan Blackwood forgot how to breathe. Sophie felt the intensity of Ethan's gaze before she even saw him. And when she did, God help her, he looked devastatingly handsome, in a classic black tuxedo, his sharp features even more striking, under the warm glow of the chandeliers. But it wasn't just his appearance that made her stomach tighten. It was the way he was looking at her, like she was the only woman in the room, like she was a secret he wanted to uncover. A shiver ran down her spine, but she forced herself to breathe. This was just a work event, nothing more. But then dance with me. Sophie turned, startled to find Ethan standing right beside her. She hadn't even noticed him approach. Her lips parted. What? His voice was low, firm. Dance with me. Sophie's heart pounded. This was a terrible idea. But before she could say no, Ethan took her hand, his touch sending a sharp jolt of electricity through her body. And just like that, she was in his arms. The music played softly around them as they moved across the dance floor. Ethan's grip was strong but gentle, his hand resting dangerously low on her waist. Sophie swallowed hard, trying to focus on anything except how close he was. But it was impossible, because Ethan smelled like cedarwood and danger. Because his breath was warm against her temple. Because every time his fingers brushed her skin, her body betrayed her. You look beautiful, Ethan murmured, his voice rougher than usual. Sophie's breath hitched. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and that was her mistake. Because in that moment, she saw something she had never seen before. Not the cold, ruthless CEO everyone feared. Not the man who lived behind walls no one could break, but a man fighting against something he didn't want to feel. And it shattered her. Ethan, her voice, was barely above a whisper, but it was all it took. Ethan's grip tightened. His fingers traced the small of her back, his thumb brushing against her bare skin, in the most dangerous way possible. Sophie's entire body burned. This was not just a dance. This was something dangerous, something undeniable, something that could change everything. Ethan was losing control. Every step, every breath, every touch brought him closer to crossing a line he swore he wouldn't cross. But then Sophie's hand slid up his chest, her fingers lightly grazing his jaw, and he was done for. Sophie. His voice was hoarse, barely a breath. She looked up at him, her eyes dark with something he refused to name. The world around them blurred. Nothing else existed. Nothing but her. Nothing but this. His gaze dropped to her lips, and then a sharp clink of a champagne glass snapped them back to reality. Sophie gasped, stepping away like she'd been burned. Ethan clenched his fists, his breathing uneven. The moment was gone, and yet the damage was already done, because now there was no denying it. This wasn't just an attraction, it was something so much more, and neither of them were ready for it. Ethan Blackwood had made his decision. He needed distance. What happened at the gala, the dance, the touch, the almost kiss, was a mistake, a temptation he should never have entertained. Sophie Carter was off limits. She was an intern, too young, too different, too dangerous. She made him feel things he wasn't supposed to feel. And Ethan wasn't a man who let emotions dictate his actions. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He pushed her away. For the next few days he avoided her completely. No lingering glances, no conversations, no stolen moments. If she entered the same room, he left. If she needed something, he had Lucas handle it. He convinced himself it was for the best, that it was the right thing to do. But then, she stopped trying. At first, Sophie had seemed confused, even a little hurt, by his sudden coldness. She would glance at him in meetings, waiting for some acknowledgement that never came. She lingered outside his office, as if debating whether to knock, but after a few days, she stopped. She no longer tried to meet his gaze, no longer attempted to speak to him, and Ethan should have been relieved. Instead, he felt something disturbingly close to regret. The office was unusually quiet that evening. Most employees had already gone home, but Sophie remained at her desk, typing away furiously. Ethan stood in his office, watching her through the glass wall. She looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she rubbed her temples every few minutes, as if trying to fight off a headache. A sharp pang of guilt shot through him. Had he done this to her? No. He was not responsible for her emotions. He was just doing what was necessary. And yet, before he could stop himself, he was already walking out of his office and straight to her desk. You should go home. Sophie froze, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. Slowly she looked up, and there it was. The wall she had built between them. She nodded stiffly. I will. I just have a few things to finish. Ethan's jaw clenched. He hated this. Hated the distance between them. Hated how she looked at him now, like he was just her boss and nothing more. It was what he wanted. So why did it feel so damn wrong? He hesitated before saying, Sophie, her lips parted slightly, as if she had been waiting for him to say something, anything. But before he could find the words, the moment was shattered. A loud crash echoed through the office. The next thing Ethan knew, the overhead lights flickered and died, and then, total darkness. Sophie's breath hitched. What just happened? Ethan pulled out his phone, using the screen's dim light to glance around. Power outage. Sophie swallowed. But we have backup generators, right? They did. Which meant something was wrong. Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from Lucas. Lucas, electrical issue. The system's down. You're stuck on the 25th floor until they fix it. Ethan exhaled sharply. Great. He turned back to Sophie, whose fingers had curled around the edge of her desk. She was nervous. Of course. She didn't know the building like he did, didn't know that the emergency systems would eventually kick in. And yet, as Ethan watched her shift uncomfortably in the dark, he realized this wasn't just nervousness. This was fear. Sophie, his voice was softer now. Are you afraid of the dark? There was a pause. And then finally a quiet confession. Not the dark. Just being trapped in it. A sharp tug pulled at Ethan's chest. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was terrified. Without thinking, he moved closer. Hey, it's okay. We're safe. Sophie let out a shaky breath. I know. I don't like small spaces. Or being stuck. It's stupid. It wasn't stupid. Not when he could hear the unsteady tremor in her voice. Not when she was gripping the desk so tightly her knuckles were white. Without hesitation, Ethan reached for her hand. Sophie sucked in a sharp breath, as his fingers curled around hers. Warm. Steady. Safe. For a moment she didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, she squeezed back. Something in Ethan's chest tightened. They stood there, hands entwined, the only sound between them the faint hum of city noise beyond the windows. And in that darkness, in that silent moment, Ethan knew he was in trouble, because no matter how much distance he tried to put between them, Sophie Carter had already gotten under his skin. The emergency lights finally flickered on, casting a dim glow over the office. Sophie exhaled, relief washing over her. But Ethan, he still hadn't let go of her hand. Slowly she looked up at him. Ethan, his expression was unreadable, his grip on her hand, unwavering. And then a confession slipped from his lips before he could stop it. I don't want to stay away from you. Sophie's breath caught. What? Ethan exhaled, his jaw tightening, as if he hated admitting it. I tried. I really did. But it's not working. Sophie's heart was racing now, pounding against her ribs. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes dark and intense. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you don't feel this too. Sophie's lips parted, but no words came, because she did feel it. She had always felt it. She had just never expected him to admit it first. And in that moment, standing in the dim glow of the emergency lights, everything changed. Sophie barely slept that night. She tossed and turned, replaying Ethan's words over and over in her mind. "I don't want to stay away from you." That confession had changed everything. The way he looked at her, the way his hand had lingered in hers, the way his voice had been rough with something dangerously close to desperation. It wasn't just attraction, it was something more. But what did it mean? What did they mean? The next morning, as she walked into Blackwood Enterprises, her heart pounded with anticipation. Would Ethan acknowledge what had happened? Would he act like it never did? Or worse, would he regret it? As soon as she stepped into the office, she knew something was off. People were whispering, glancing at her, smirking. Her stomach twisted uneasily. What was going on? And then she saw Lucas, Ethan's right-hand man, approaching her with a grim expression. "Sophie, we need to talk." Lucas guided Sophie into an empty conference room and shut the door. She crossed her arms, trying to mask her unease. "What's going on?" Lucas exhaled heavily, then slid his phone across the table. "This." Sophie picked it up and froze. There on the screen was a gossip article. "Mystery woman steals the heart of billionaire CEO." Her stomach dropped. The article was filled with speculation about Ethan's love life, and at the center of it all, her blurry photo of her and Ethan in his office, his hand brushing against hers. A second photo from the gala, him staring at her with unmistakable longing. And worst of all, a new headline spreading across business forums. "Intern Sedos, CEO. How far did she go for the job?" Sophie felt sick. Her entire body burned with humiliation. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a full-blown scandal. And the worst part, people were going to believe it. Sophie barely had time to process the disaster before Lucas sighed. "Ethan wants to see you." Her breath hitched. Of course he did. She swallowed her nerves and made her way to his office, her hands shaking as she knocked. "Come in." She stepped inside, her heart pounding as she met Ethan's gaze. His expression was unreadable, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists on his desk. Sophie didn't even wait for him to speak. "I didn't do this," she blurted. "I don't know how they got those pictures, but I swear." Ethan stood up abruptly, rounding the desk in 2 long strides. "I know." Sophie blinked. "You do." He exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "Of course I do. You think I'd believe that you—" He shook his head, his voice rough. "This is my fault." She frowned. "How is this your fault?" Ethan's eyes locked onto hers. "Because I let it happen." Her lips parted slightly, but before she could respond, he stepped closer. "I told myself I wouldn't get close to you, that it was dangerous, but I failed." His voice was raw. "And now you're paying for it." Sophie's heart twisted. Even now, he was protecting her, blaming himself. But it wasn't his fault, it was theirs. The people who thrived on gossip. The ones who turned a genuine connection into something dirty. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "What do we do?" Ethan's gaze darkened. "We fight." Ethan didn't waste time. Within the hour, his legal team was on it. Cease and desist orders were sent to media outlets. The PR team crafted an official statement, denying the rumors. But it wasn't enough. The headlines had already spread like wildfire. And the worst part, some board members were concerned. "This is a distraction, Ethan. We can't afford this kind of scandal. Maybe it's best if she leaves." Sophie's blood ran cold. They wanted her gone. Ethan's jaw clenched. His voice was calm, but dangerously firm. "She's not going anywhere." The meeting ended with tension so thick it was suffocating. As Sophie stepped out of the boardroom, her emotions swirled. She had worked too hard for this opportunity. She wasn't about to let some gossip ruin it. But then a warm hand closed around her wrist. She turned and suddenly, she was face to face with Ethan, alone. His eyes searched hers, his grip steady, protective. And then in a voice so low it made her breath catch, he said, "I won't let them take you from me."
Oh.
Her heart stopped. From me, not from the company, not from the internship, but from him. And in that moment, she knew, this wasn't just about a scandal, this was about them. And Ethan Blackwood was willing to fight for her. Sophie sat in the corner of a quiet cafe, staring at her untouched coffee. The world around her bustled with life, but she felt frozen in time, trapped in the whirlwind of scandal that had consumed her life overnight. The gossip, the whispers, the looks, it felt crushing. Her phone buzzed for the 100th time that morning. A new article, a new speculation. She squeezed her eyes shut. This wasn't what she had signed up for. She had come to prove herself, to build a career on her own merits. But now she was just the intern who seduced a billionaire. The worst part, no matter how many statements Ethan's team put out, people wanted to believe the worst. And if she stayed at Blackwood Enterprises, this wouldn't end. Not for her, not for Ethan. Her chest tightened painfully as realization settled in. Maybe she needed to walk away. She didn't even wait until the next morning. Instead, she went straight to Ethan's penthouse that night. Her heart pounded as she stepped into the elevator, every second stretching into eternity. She had to do this. For him. For herself. When the elevator doors slid open, Ethan was already waiting for her. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie loosened, his expression dark with something unreadable. "Sophie," his voice was rough, as if he had been waiting for her. She swallowed the lump in her throat and met his gaze. "I need to talk to you." He nodded once and gestured for her to sit, but she didn't. She couldn't. Because if she sat down, if she stayed in this room with him for even a second longer, she might not have the strength to leave. Taking a deep breath, she whispered, "I'm quitting." The words felt like knives in her own chest. Ethan went completely still.
Yes.
His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "No." Her breath hitched. "Ethan, no." He took a step forward, his eyes burning with something dangerously close to desperation. She forced herself to hold his gaze. "This scandal will never end if I stay." His jaw tightened. "I don't care, but I do." Her voice cracked. A heavy silence stretched between them. She turned away, blinking back tears. "You'll be fine without me, Ethan. You have a company to run, a reputation to protect." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "You think I give a damn about my reputation when it comes to you?" Her breath hitched. "This isn't about your reputation," she whispered. "It's about mine." His expression shattered. That was the breaking point. Ethan crossed the space between them, in 3 long strides, and cupped her face in his hands. "Don't do this." His voice was raw. "Don't walk away from me." She squeezed her eyes shut. "You know I have to." A sharp exhale left his lips, and then suddenly, his forehead was against hers, his breath mingling with hers, his hands trembling against her cheeks. "Tell me you don't feel anything for me, Sophie," he whispered, hoarsely. "Say it, and I'll let you go." Her heart pounded. Her lips parted. She wanted to say it. She had to say it. But she couldn't, because it would be a lie. And Ethan saw the truth in her silence. A soft, almost broken chuckle escaped him. And then, he kissed her. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was desperate. Ethan's lips crashed against hers, as if he had been holding himself back for far too long. Sophie gasped, her hands fisting into his shirt, as he pulled her closer, as if he couldn't bear even an inch of distance between them. The world around them disappeared. There was no scandal, no rumors, no expectations, just them. His lips moved against hers with aching intensity, with a hunger that sent shivers down her spine. His hands slid down her back, pressing her flush against him, and she melted, completely. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. His forehead pressed against hers once more. His hands still cradling her face, as if she might disappear. His voice was rough, but unshakable. "Stay." She opened her mouth to argue, to protest, to say something. but all that came out was a whisper. Ethan.
Yes.
His eyes searched hers, desperate, pleading. I don't care what the world says. I don't care about anything but this. You and me. That's all that matters. Tears burned in her eyes. But what if? No what ifs. He brushed a thumb against her lips. Just us. And just like that, Sophie knew she was his. No matter what happened next. The next morning, the scandal still existed. The rumors were still there, but everything was different. Because now they weren't running, they weren't hiding. Ethan held her hand as they walked into Blackwood Enterprises, his grip firm, unwavering. A statement was released that day, not denying the rumors, but confirming them. Ethan Blackwood confirms relationship with Sophie Carter. The business world exploded. The board was in shock, his competitors whispered. But Ethan didn't care. Because for the first time in his life, the billionaire CEO, who had never fallen in love, had found something worth risking everything for. The warm summer breeze danced through the open terrace of the Blackwood estate, carrying the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass. The setting sun bathed everything in golden light, casting a soft glow over the elegantly decorated space. Sophie stood at the edge of the terrace, looking out at the breathtaking view of the rolling hills beyond. Her heart was light, her smile soft. She had never imagined this would be her life. 1 year ago, she had walked away from Blackwood Enterprises, thinking she was making the right decision for both of them. But Ethan hadn't let her go. He had fought for her, loved her, proved to the world that their love was real, no matter what anyone said. And now today, they stood here, stronger than ever. She felt a pair of strong arms wrap around her from behind, pulling her close. You look beautiful. Ethan's deep, familiar voice sent a warm shiver down her spine. She leaned into him, resting her hands over his. You always say that, because it's always true. He pressed a soft kiss to her temple, his voice filled with nothing but adoration. She turned in his arms, looking up into those striking blue eyes that had once seemed so cold, so unreachable. But now they were soft, warm, full of love. Sophie traced her fingers along his jaw,
Yes.
a teasing smile playing on her lips. Mr. Blackwood, are you getting sentimental on me? Ethan chuckled, his hands settling at her waist. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm always sentimental when it comes to you. Her breath caught in her throat. She would never get tired of hearing that. Never get tired of the way he loved her. Completely, fearlessly. Their wedding had been the event of the century. Despite the rumors, despite the scrutiny, Ethan had made no apology about loving her. And when he had taken her hand that day, looking into her eyes, as he vowed to love her for the rest of his life, nothing else had mattered. Not the headlines, not the world's expectations, just them. Sophie ran her fingers over the Blackwood Enterprises logo. At the top of her new office door, Vice President, Innovation and Strategy, she smiled. It hadn't been easy proving herself in the corporate world, but she had done it, on her own terms. Now she wasn't just Ethan Blackwood's wife, she was his partner in every way. And as she stepped inside her office, she felt unstoppable, because love hadn't made her weak, it had made her stronger. Late at night, in the quiet of their home, Sophie curled up beside Ethan on the couch, her head resting against his chest. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over them. Ethan ran his fingers through her hair, his voice a whisper against her forehead. You changed everything, you know that. She looked up at him, her heart swelling. I could say the same about you. His lips brushed against hers in a slow, lingering kiss. Then I guess we changed each other. She smiled against his lips, for the better. And in that moment, wrapped in his arms, knowing that no matter what the world threw at them, they would always choose each other, Sophie knew one thing for certain. They had won, because real love always does.